the Friday Cocktail, presented by Anna Glavinsky.
We're looking at the history of a city that I've never been to, unfortunately, but I've known plenty of people, especially people going on stag parties, actually, who have been to this city. And here to talk us through about 1,000 years worth of history of Prague, the heart of Europe, is historian Cynthia Paces. Good evening, Cynthia. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me on your program.
Yeah, delighted to have you. You know, Prague is a really well-known city, even in today's day and age. And like I said, people often go there for stag do's, hen parties and stuff like that. Why is that these days?
To be honest, some of it is the inexpensive and yet delicious beer. Prague has been brewing beer actually for almost as long as it's existed. So there was a beer industry in monasteries going back to like the 10th century, 11th century. And then they also had a lot of German people living in the city. And so the style of beer now is more of a kind of lager that is light, easy to drink. But in terms of, that really is one of the draws, I think. But, it's a fun city to be in. One of the things I really love about it is I often say that the whole city is a museum. And you can walk around and you don't have to go into a museum and see the art and the architecture. It's all there. It's on the buildings. It's in, the theaters. Everything is richly decorated. There's like architecture from, the 11th century all the way to yesterday. So walking around the city, it's very walkable. It has beautiful views. So in addition to fun places to have a drink and eat, there's indoor and outdoor places for that. It's just a great city. It's a walking city. There's a lot of music. There's a lot of jazz clubs. So definitely the one thing that I would have to say, though, for your listeners is sometimes the stag parties get a little out of hand, and the Prague city has put some noise ordinances in because it is a small city and there's so many people coming. A lot of American university students study there, and this kind of inexpensive weekend trip. So it's wonderful to go, but you have to sort of also respect that it's a place where people live and really care about the place they live. Like, they love the beauty of their city too.
Absolutely. So they don't want it just, welcome, have fun, but don't wreck the place sort of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Let's pinpoint this geographically. Prague, where exactly is it today? And also, obviously, you go back about 1,000 years or so in its history. So the geography of Europe actually has changed over that time as well.
Right. So Prague is the capital of the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic, by and large, is the kind of same geographical space as what was called the Bohemian lands up until the 20th century. So the Bohemian lands were a separate Czech dynasty for several hundred years, and eventually became part of the Austrian Empire in 1526 and remained so until 1918, when Czechoslovakia was founded. In 1993, as you probably know, the country broke apart into the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, and Prague remained the capital city for the Czech Republic. So Prague is in Bohemia, And Bohemia is the western province of the Czech Republic, and Moravia and a little bit of Silesia are the other places. In the Middle Ages, Prague was a very central place on the trade routes. So the north-south trade route between Scandinavia and Venice went very close to Prague, and the west-east that you can trace a trade route that goes all the way from Spain into France, across the continent, and into Russia also passes by. So there's a crossroads that's not far from Prague. And that's one of the reasons why it became such an important city in the Middle Ages in Central Europe. And we have records going back to, like, they think the late 10th century, so the 900s, where a Spanish trader or diplomat, not sure exactly what he was, but he writes about Prague as a place where there's a huge marketplace, and there are people from Poland and Hungary, and there are Jewish people all trading in this marketplace. And he says you can get, all of the goods you would want. You can get good food. So in a way, it's like the same kind of thing. People go to the Christmas markets in Prague now. And of course, markets were different, but people went there also for trading. So that's one of the reasons why geographically it's an important place, and why I call my book The Heart of Europe. Some of it has to do with a geographical center, and some of it has to do more as a cultural and political center.
Yeah, because there's so many elements in this book that describe this city. You also talk about the poetical side a little bit as well. I've got quotes here: the city of 100 spires and the mother of cities. Lovely quotes. Why do you think it's captured people's imaginations in that way?
Well, it's very beautiful. There's no doubt about that. There people who are sort of architectural historians, one of the things they've talked about is this idea that there's a lot of balance in the architecture, so that you have height with the 10,000, the 1,000, 100 spires. There are lots of different numbers, but the 100 spires. So all of these kind of churches, but also the castle on the hill. But then you also have this horizontal plane. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but a lot of historians of architecture have talked about that there are very few cities that have that kind of vertical and horizontal access that apparently is very welcoming to people, so it's aesthetically pleasing. And then, one of the fortunate things for Prague is that, unlike so many of the German cities, the Polish cities, Prague was not destroyed during World War II. So the architecture that you see is original. Some things have been renovated, but you see churches that date from the 11th century. You see a Gothic cathedral and other Gothic churches that were built in the 14th century. And then you see all of this Baroque architecture that comes from the 17th century. And then there's a sort of national revival in the 19th century, and there's all of this kind of neoclassical and then Art Nouveau architecture. So like I was saying about sort of the whole city as a museum, I think that's why it's just there's a place where you come up from the metro. And I've taken students to Prague for many, many years, and I'll take them on the first day to go up this particular stair. And you go through this sort of little arch, and you're looking at the castle, and one of the university buildings is on the right. And inevitably, everyone gasps. Like, it's hard to explain just sort of how beautiful that first look at the castle, the river is. And, you know, I have been going there since the early 1990s. Well, actually, 1990 was my first visit there. And I still can't get over it sometimes. I'm like, wow, this is an incredibly beautiful place. How lucky am I that I get to go back and write about it?
And it does sound absolutely stunning, and it draws so many people there because of this. But how much of that beauty hides a violence in its history as well? You know, it isn't all just roses and Christmas markets and beautiful spires.
Right, absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that really is one of the main points of my book. And in talking about this, excuse me, poetry that has been evoked from the city, I also talk about these tremendous tensions that mark really the whole history. So very much at the beginning, when you're talking about the early Middle Ages, you have rivalries among these kind of warring families who eventually established this Duchy of Bohemia. But when you get closer, you know, sort of really actually from the Middle Ages to the 20th century, you have three major communities that live in Prague. The Czechs, so the Slavic-speaking people who have migrated there from the East. But you have a very big German community of people who have lived there as traders, as artisans, as experts in a variety of fields, who came also in the early Middle Ages and settled there. And then Prague had the largest Jewish population in Europe in 1700, and it had, you know, from the early Middle Ages, like I said, the first mention of this market talks about Jews trading in the markets. And so you have this very important center of Jewish learning and sort of culture there. And of course, that creates a very tense atmosphere at different times. There are many times in the history where those three communities interact and maybe keep separate to some extent, but are also tolerant of each other. But there's a lot of examples at the same time of anti-Semitism, a terrible massacre that took place in the 14th century. Maria Theresa, who's often known as this Enlightenment figure, expelled all the Jews in 1742 because she saw them as traitors. They then are invited back because they're important to the economy. And then, you know, of course, tragically, the 20th century is marked by the Nazi occupation and the Holocaust and the death of most of Prague's Jews. And so now there's a beautiful essay that was written by the son of a rabbi who did survive the Holocaust. And he writes what was lost, and that we go there. You know, you talked about going as a tourist, and one of the most amazing things to visit is the Jewish quarter. And there are synagogues that date from 1270 there, the beautiful old cemetery, other synagogues in the town hall. But it's a museum. It's literally the Jewish Museum of Prague. There is a small Jewish community there, but nothing compared to what it had been. And, you know, there is a feeling that Czechs have sort of said this is their land, and it really is now. It's much more like mono-ethnic than it used to be. But it really was the home of many different groups for most of its history. Like, it being this Czech capital is actually very new compared to this long history.
And how did you approach writing about some of the more sensitive topics like that? How did you choose to approach it? And especially, you know, you've got things that happened hundreds of years ago, which always I think in human consciousness seem so far removed. Perhaps, I don't know, you tell me, it'd be easier to write about than something that happened in more recent history that people still talk about, people's grandparents still remember. So, yeah, how did you sort of approach those sorts of topics in a factual book?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think, I'm a trained historian, so we work with a lot of primary sources. And so in doing that, I think I let the people in many ways speak for themselves wherever we could have some kind of document. So, for example, that 1389 massacre, there was a rabbi who had been a boy during the massacre, and he survived, but he remembers what happened. The synagogue burned. He lost relatives, and he actually, his gravestone is the oldest identifiable gravestone in the Jewish cemetery. He wrote this long elegy about the massacre, and some of the information we have about the massacre comes from that source. And it's been translated into English by a historian, and this elegy was used in Yom Kippur services at the Old New Synagogue for hundreds and hundreds of years. So even though it was a long time ago, it was actually remembered by the Jewish community through this poem. So I do the same type of thing as much as I can for the later periods. The Jewish community that was expelled by Maria Theresa writes a letter actually to the Jewish community in London and in other European cities and says, please help us. Like, we've been kicked out of our country. And then in the 20th century, we do have some beautiful memoirs and novels that are based on people's experiences. So there's a book, Life with a Star, by Jiří Weil, who was a Czech writer who survived the war by pretending he had committed suicide. And his novel, Life with a Star, is a semi-autobiographical account of that. So I think that's one of the ways I'm able to do it. And I think I teach courses on genocide and the Holocaust, and so it's something I'm committed to. One thing that was so important to me, as much as I love Prague and love the beauty and everything we talked about, it was really important to say this is more than just a beautiful place. This is a place where, history happened, where people suffered too.
Yeah, and so, Prague's got a very, very rich history, and I say that word as in depth, not just beautiful, wonderful. There's a lot of stories behind its past. What about the future? I know you're a historian, but where do you see Prague sitting with adopting modern technologies, modern ideas, and going on into the future?
Yes, yeah. So I have really seen a transformation of the city. As I said, I went in 1990, which was only about maybe 7 months after the revolution in November 1989 that took down the Communist Party, a few weeks after the Berlin Wall fell. And when I got there, there was not a lot of foreign investment. Most of the stores were still state owned. They were transforming the economy into a sort of global capitalist economy. And with that, there are losses, just like there are really everywhere in the world, right? Anywhere you go, you can see McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken and H&M, wherever you go, there is kind of a uniform capitalist culture, and that is certainly true in I also think we started and it's fun to talk about, like I said, the beer and the great cultural life, but like so many cities, places like Venice, Prague has also had to say, our old town is very small, and how can we accommodate floods of people coming? So in terms of the future, I think that there needs to be respect toward the capital by people who visit it. Tourism is the number one industry in Prague, and they now need that for the economy, but it has to be sustainable because the more people go, it influences the climate, it influences the infrastructure. In terms of, one thing that's very interesting in that 35 years that I've been going there is I think by and large Czechs really feel as though they have become Europeans. So there's always differences of opinions about the EU as we know, but Prague people especially sort of think of themselves as returning to Europe, so that their entry into the EU, into NATO. In fact, the current president of Czech Republic came up through military leadership in NATO. And as somebody who's a historian who grew up during the communist period, that's kind of remarkable because, they were in the Warsaw Pact, not NATO, for many, many years. So I do think that, it's a small state, but it's important for the small states to be represented in the EU. And, they have held on to a democracy. There are always problems in terms of the same things that we've been talking about. There is prejudice against Roma. There is a Vietnamese community there that sometimes faces prejudice. So, that populism that we see around the whole world is definitely there in the Czech Republic too. So I have a good feeling about the future. But, just like we all have to be aware of what, differences of cultures coming together, that there needs to be that kind of respect. And that's a lesson, I think, in reading, a long history of a city, is like you see the times where what that diversity can create, but you also see like where it can go wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, you've pretty much answered what was going to be my final question on what do you hope that readers get out of the book. I think just from listening to you talk and the way that you've spoken, you've given us a lot of messages, a lot of things to think about and takeaways. So I guess I'll end it with, is there anything else that you would like to talk about from the book, or you just feel that needs to be mentioned today?
Well, I do hope, I certainly, like you said, want people to get that sense of a diverse, vibrant history. But I'd also say that I would love for people who pick up the book to say, I want to go there. So we have to, I was cautioning about tourism, and yet I want people to experience the beauty. And one thing that I was so grateful for in working on this book is that I was able to include a lot of color photographs that some which I took, and some are art from the city. And then there's a lot of black and white illustrations too. So I do want people to come away with what unique architectural combinations exist in this place. So I do hope people, don't only sort of travel there in the armchair of reading, but do kind of fall in love with the city like I did so many years ago.
In real life. Well, thank you so much. You've been listening to Cynthia Paces. She's a historian and author of Prague, the Heart of Europe. You can find it on Amazon or on the Talk Radio Europe bookshop. Cynthia, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking with you.